I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Anne Bentley. For her day job, Anne is a board member and immediate past global chair of QS consultancy, Ryder Levitt Bucknell. She's been a staple on the Construction Leadership Council and chairs the strategic board of the Transforming Construction Network, N+. Good morning, Anne.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
So my first question to you, Anne, is in construction, we seem to understand the cost of everything, but do you believe we have a clear view on what value really means?
I'm not even sure we understand the cost. I think what we understand is the tender price. The fact of the matter is that we all know that many jobs are tendered on cost, which then forces contractors and the supply chain. It's just the same for consultants. They're tendered on cost as well. It forces people to make the most literal interpretation of the brief that's possible, irrespective of whether that actually performs what you actually know the client wants to happen. So you literally price it as written, and then really wait for the claims to come in. So number one, we don't even know what the cost is, because when you take into account the cost of rework, the cost of waste, the cost of sort of inefficiency in the process, the cost is completely different. If you take into account the cost of putting right latent defects, and I don't just mean the actual cost, but I mean the cost to the users of the asset or the occupiers of the building, it becomes significantly greater. If you then add to that the cost of the fact that the thing doesn't work properly, so it might have been built properly, but it might not work properly because it was poorly specified or the wrong thing was built in the wrong place or whatever, then actually the cost multiplies by, factors of 5, 10, 15, 20, suddenly. So actually, all we really know is what was the actual final account. That's the only cost we know. And very few clients actually assess any of the other costs. Whereas value is, of course, a completely different thing, because value is essentially how much did the benefits that accrue to me cost me. When it comes to spending billions and billions and billions of pounds in the built environment, we seem to completely forget value, and we just go, write us a specification, tender against the specification, and tell us what it costs. And it's complete nonsense. It doesn't work. It's never worked.
And that just perpetuates negative behaviour at every stage of the supply chain, doesn't it? Because people tend to go in with lowest price cost. And almost in fairness, that the profit is found in the variation and the revaluation rather than in that initial sort of true and honest tender price.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's not true of every single client. There are some really good examples of where value is captured and does exist, and they tend to be more on frameworks where you can see that there's a very long-term relationship between the client and the supply chain, often where there's incentivization for innovation or shared savings or that sort of thing. So it's not universally bad, but I would say enough of it is bad to be able to say that the majority is bad.
Is that where the toolkit kicks in, Anne?
What the toolkit does, in essence, is it gives clients and the supply chain a framework on which they can, number one, define value, but then obviously once they've defined it, they can measure value against and make sure that both during the design and the construction and the performance of the asset, that value is actually delivered. Now, the framework at its most simplistic level has 4 elements to it. So we look at what the environmental impact or the natural value is. We do look at cost, but that's the thing called the produced value, the produced capital. Produced doesn't just take into account cost, it takes into account functionality, it takes into account time, and it takes into account whole life as well as capital cost. But we also then are looking at what many people would say call social value, but we've split social value up into the human impact and, if you like, the community impact.
If I look at the supply chain now, contractors often feel, at the moment particularly, that they're powerless in this change. The change is going to be done to us. But what can we do to drive positive change from our part of the supply chain and hopefully reap the rewards of that?
So, I think there are 2 or 3 things that all of us can do. I think the first thing is a real sort of mindset change to try and genuinely understand, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, because I think very few of us genuinely understand what actually marks success for the client. Now, the deeper you are into the supply chain, the more difficult this is, because, you know, if you've been asked to price up, I don't know, so many square meters of dry lining, whether or not that the client is trying to sort of educate children or process meat packaging probably isn't that important to you in truth, because you've just been asked to price up so many square meters of dry lining. But actually, unless all of us really try to understand what it is the client is genuinely trying to achieve, not the specification, but the ultimate outcome of what they're trying to achieve, then we will always be at this lowest common denominator of price per square meter or whatever, because we haven't got anything else to hang it on. The supply chain are the only people that can deliver this. I mean, the client can't deliver this on their own. If the client is saying at their top level, environmental excellence is our driver, you know, we want to minimize embodied carbon, we want to minimize carbon in use, and yet they have specified a product for one of your members to price that is actually a mediocre performing product, then engagement can only take place if the client is happy for a supplier to come back and go, you've actually specified the wrong product here. You've said that your driver is this, but actually, why did you specify that then?
Where these things do currently exist, they're sort of written into the contract, and they become a penalty if you don't deliver them, rather than something that you can contribute to and help to evolve.
One of the things that we often say to clients is, why aren't you allowing alternative bids? Many public sector clients are absolutely terrified of non-compliant bids, if you like, and so they don't allow alternative bids. We say, but if you don't allow alternative bids, what you're actually doing is cutting out the expertise of the very people that actually know how to do this, because if your designer has specified something that's a bit old-fashioned, or they weren't aware of the innovation that's just happened, or they didn't know that one company was just better at doing it but in a slightly different way, then by forcing people into a narrow specification, you are actually potentially asking for a worse product.
Does that help to actually? Is there a possibility through the frameworks and the tender process to actually enforce earlier engagement? Because often it feels, again, in this part of the supply chain, it feels like it's keep them lean and hungry, make them quote late so they're desperate for the work, rather than quote early so they can help us deliver.
The trick, if you like, the toolkit is maybe unlocked that many people have been struggling with for a long time, is how do you then compare these different things? So if you have a tender that is slightly more expensive but delivers much higher social value, does that represent better value than the cheaper one that's only just compliant and actually isn't very good on carbon either? Now, at the moment, where we have that is because we have minimum compliance standards, you actually buy the cheapest compliant bids. That's all clients ever do. And sometimes they're only borderline compliant, if I'm honest, as well. Whereas by saying, no, that's not what we're looking at, instead of looking at price, we're actually effectively using a comparative index. It actually means that people who have better products won't be penalized because they're slightly more expensive, or this is the theory. But the only way that the client will actually know that they're better products is by actually entering into some sort of dialogue. So instead of actually going, I want one of those and it has to be green and it has to be this shape or whatever, actually entering into that dialogue of saying, well, what are the different ways of solving this problem? Now, that is such an obvious thing to say, but it's also such a difficult thing for clients to do when you've got very extended and deep supply chains. But the toolkit will really be prompting those conversations. And if clients aren't having those conversations, or at least the client's advisors, and a lot of this does fall on the sort of who's actually implementing this, then we will see a sort of, if you like, a separation in the industry, I think, where there will be clients that are actually genuinely value driven, and there will be other clients that are going, no, I just want one of these, and so long as it it doesn't break the law, I'll just buy the cheapest. And I sort of think we might have to accept that not all clients will want to engage. But what that does mean is that suppliers can sort of get a measure of their client before they decide to bid. So there might be some suppliers, I mean, if you happen to have a really efficient manufacturing process and you know that you can beat all your competitors on price, then you might be happy to compete on price. Whereas if you actually know you've got a better product, then you might only want to go tender with the clients that are actually prepared to take a broader view of value.
Well, that leads us beautifully into the last question, actually, Anne, which is what type of companies do you think will be successful, particularly at the specialist end of the marketplace, as the market evolves?
The types of companies that will survive will be the ones that absolutely understand the value they deliver and don't try and be all things to all men. But secondly, we will have to have continuous innovation because the market is going to demand better products, it's going to demand more sustainable products, it's going to demand products with longer life spans that are cheaper to use over the whole sort of lifetime of the building. So we will definitely need innovative contractors. The other thing that I think we will see more of, to be honest, is more frameworks, more longer established supply chains. So not just a supply chain coming together for a single project, but supply chains actually building deeper relationships, both vertically but also horizontally. And what I mean by that is many specialist companies work better if they work with other specialist companies that they already know and trust and understand.
That's brilliant, and that's been absolutely amazing. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
No problem at all. Thank you.